In a crowded restaurant where strangers sat elbow to elbow, 8-year-old Jamie stood with his worn backpack clutched against his chest, his eyes fixed on a plate of half-eaten pasta, about to be cleared away, the hollow ache in his stomach making him bold enough to ask the question he'd rehearsed in his head. "Excuse me, sir, are you going to throw that away? Because if you are, I was wondering if maybe I could have it instead." The waiter, Miguel, froze with the plate in his hand, something in the child's thin face and threadbare clothes causing him to set the dish down, as memories of his own hungry childhood crashed over him like a wave. The manager watched from across the room, his expression hardening as Miguel stepped away from the table, breaking protocol in a way that could cost him the job he desperately needed to support his own family. What happened next would change not just one hungry child's life, but an entire community's understanding of compassion and dignity. If you believe that small acts of kindness can create ripples of change in our broken world, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Miguel Alvarez had been working at Giovanni's Italian restaurant for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. He knew the precise count because each day at this job meant another day. His family had food on the table, another payment toward his daughter's asthma medication, another small deposit in the savings account that might someday help his children attend college. At 34, Miguel carried the weight of 2 worlds on his shoulders, the life he'd built here in America and the memory of the one he'd left behind in Guatemala. He'd started as a dishwasher, spending endless hours with his hands submerged in scalding water, scrubbing away strangers' half-eaten meals. The irony wasn't lost on him. How much food went into the garbage each night while he remembered the gnawing emptiness of hunger from his childhood. After 18 months of arriving early and staying late, he'd been promoted to waiter, nearly doubling his income through tips. His wife Elena had cried when he brought home his first week's earnings. "It's happening, mi amor," she'd whispered, counting the bills at their small kitchen table after the children were asleep. The dream is really happening, but the dream remained fragile, balanced on the knife edge of circumstance. One misstep, one complaint from the wrong customer, one violation of restaurant policy, and it could all collapse. Miguel had seen it happen to others. Marco, who'd been fired for taking home leftover bread at the end of his shift. Sophia, who'd lost her job after comping a dessert for an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. Policy is policy, Victor. The manager had explained with a shrug that suggested regret, but accepted necessity. If I make an exception once, where does it end? And now, standing with a half-empty plate of fettuccine alfredo in his hand and looking into the eyes of a hungry child, Miguel found himself at exactly the kind of crossroads he'd always feared. Something about the boy's face triggered memories Miguel had spent years trying to bury. The hollow cheeks, the dark circles under eyes too old for such a young face, the careful way he stood, slightly hunched as if to make himself invisible until the precise moment he needed to be seen. Miguel knew that posture intimately. He'd perfected it himself by age 6. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant chatter. "I won't make a mess. I can just sit in the corner." Miguel glanced across the dining room, instantly locating Victor's tall figure by the hostess stand. The manager was watching, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrowed with suspicion or concern. Miguel couldn't tell which. The restaurant's policy was crystal clear. No free food, no exceptions. No, employees weren't even allowed to take home leftovers. A rule reinforced by the cameras mounted in strategic corners of the kitchen and dining area. "What's your name, buddy?" Miguel asked, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. "And consequences?" "Jamie," the boy replied, his eyes still fixed on the plate. Miguel noticed a small tremor in the child's hands as they clutched his backpack straps. When had the boy last eaten? The question formed and dissolved as memories crashed through Miguel's carefully constructed defenses. Suddenly, he was 7 years old again, standing outside a restaurant in Guatemala City, watching through the window as tourists ate enough food for 3 people, then left half of it on their plates. He remembered pressing his face against the glass until a waiter shooed him away, remembered the shame burning hotter than the hunger as he ran back to where his mother waited, too proud to beg but too poor to buy what they needed. "I have a son about your age," Miguel said, keeping his voice casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. "He loves pasta too." Jamie's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering across his features before caution tamped it down. This was a child who had learned not to trust easily, not to expect kindness from strangers. Another mirror reflection that made Miguel's chest ache. "Where are your parents, Jamie?" he asked, setting the plate down on the table, out of the boy's reach but still visible, a promise not yet fulfilled or broken. Jamie's gaze dropped to his worn sneakers. "My dad's at home. He doesn't know I'm here." The words came, out in a rush as if he'd been holding them back. "Please don't call anyone. I just thought, since you were going to throw it away anyway." Miguel felt the weight of Victor's stare boring into his back. He knew the manager was likely already moving across the restaurant floor, coming to enforce the policy Miguel was dangerously close to breaking. 3 years of careful compliance, of swallowing his objections when perfectly good food was tossed into the garbage while people went hungry outside the restaurant's doors. 3 years of putting his family's security above his sense of right and wrong. But looking at Jamie, Miguel saw more than just a hungry child. He saw a system that failed its most vulnerable, that prioritized profit over compassion, that treated food as a privilege rather than a right. And in that moment, something shifted inside him, a quiet but seismic realignment of values that would change the course of many lives, including his own. "Come with me," Miguel said, making his decision. He left the plate on the table and placed a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder, steering him not toward the door as restaurant policy would dictate, but toward the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. "Miguel?" Victor's voice cut through the dining room noise. "What are you doing?" Miguel turned, meeting his manager's gaze directly for perhaps the first time in 3 years. "The right thing," he said simply. "For once, I'm doing the right thing." He could see the conflicting emotions on Victor's face, annoyance at the policy violation warring with something else, something that looked surprisingly like reluctant respect. Miguel didn't wait for Victor to decide which would win. He guided Jamie through the kitchen doors, away from the curious stares of diners who had begun to notice the small drama unfolding in their midst. In the bright fluorescence of Giovanni's kitchen, amid the controlled chaos of the dinner rush, Miguel introduced Jamie to Chef Paolo, a burly man whose fierce appearance masked a surprisingly gentle temperament. "This is my friend," Miguel said, the simple declaration, leaving no room for questions. "He's hungry." Paolo looked from Miguel to the small boy, then to the kitchen doors where Victor now stood, his expression unreadable. The chef had worked at Giovanni's even longer than Miguel, had weathered 3 different managers and countless corporate policy changes. He knew exactly what Miguel was risking. "Policy is policy," Paolo said, his Italian accent thickening as it always did when he was stressed. Then, almost imperceptibly, he winked at Jamie. "But hunger is hunger. And in my kitchen, no, one stays hungry." As Paolo turned to prepare a fresh plate of pasta, Miguel caught Jamie's eye and saw something there that made all the potential consequences worthwhile. A flicker of hope, of trust restored, of the simple human dignity that comes from being treated as someone who matters. In that moment, Miguel understood that regardless of what happened next, he had made the only choice he could live with. "Gracias," Jamie whispered, though Miguel had never mentioned being Spanish-speaking. The universal language of kindness needed no translation. Victor Daniels prided himself on running a tight ship. In his 6 years as manager of Giovanni's, he'd transformed the once struggling restaurant into one of the chain's top performers in the region. Quarterly reports showed consistently increasing profits, Labor costs were kept precisely at corporate targets, and food waste had been reduced by an impressive 17% under his leadership. These weren't just numbers to Victor. They were proof of his worth, evidence that he had escaped the poverty of his childhood through discipline and adherence to rules. The gold name tag on his perfectly pressed shirt represented more than authority. It was a talisman against ever returning to the uncertainty he'd known growing up, when his mother had worked 3 jobs and still struggled to keep the lights on. Success requires sacrifice, his business professor had drilled into him, and Victor had taken that lesson to heart. He'd sacrificed friendships, relationships, even his passion for painting, all in pursuit of the stability a corporate career promised. Sometimes, in rare moments of honesty with himself, he wondered if the trade had been worth it, but such thoughts were dangerous, so he buried them beneath spreadsheets and policy manuals. Now, watching Miguel lead the small boy into the kitchen, Victor felt the familiar tension between policy and humanity, a conflict he usually resolved swiftly in favor of rules. Giovanni's corporate handbook was explicit. Unauthorized persons were prohibited from entering the kitchen area. Food was never to be given away without proper payment. Employees who violated these policies were subject to immediate termination. Simple, clear, unemotional. So why was he hesitating now, standing in the doorway instead of striding into the kitchen to end this obvious violation? Perhaps it was the memory that had surfaced when he'd first noticed the boy. Small for his age, worn clothes carefully clean, eyes too watchful for a child. Victor had seen himself in that careful stance, in the practiced casualness that tried to mask desperation. He'd perfected the same pose outside his middle school cafeteria, waiting for friends to discard unwanted portions of their lunches so he could claim them without admitting hunger. "Everything okay, Mr. Daniels?" Lisa, the hostess, appeared at his elbow, her customer service smile faltering as she sensed his tension. "Fine," he replied automatically, "just handling a situation." He pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen's controlled chaos. The dinner rush was in full swing, line cooks calling orders, servers weaving through with practiced efficiency. Victor spotted Miguel immediately, standing near Paulo's station, where the head chef was, Victor could hardly believe it, preparing a fresh plate of pasta for the boy, who sat perched on a stainless steel stool, eyes wide with wonder at the behind-the-scenes view of the restaurant. "Miguel," Victor said, his voice cutting through the kitchen noise with practiced authority. "A word," Miguel said something to the boy before walking over, his expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. Victor recognized it, the look of a man prepared to accept consequences for a choice he didn't regret. It was unsettling, seeing such certainty in an employee who had always been so careful to follow every rule. "You know this is against at least 3 different policies," Victor said, keeping his voice low. Kitchen staff had remarkable hearing when it came to potential drama. "I know," Miguel met his gaze directly. "But he's just a hungry kid, Victor. We throw away more food every night than he could eat in a month." "That's not the point." "Isn't it, though?" Miguel interrupted, surprising both of them with his boldness. "Isn't feeding hungry people exactly what a restaurant should do?" Victor felt a flicker of irritation at having his authority questioned. "We're a business, not a charity. If we start giving away food to every person with a sad story—" "He's 8 years old," Miguel cut in again, his voice tight with emotion. "He was going to eat scraps from a stranger's plate. What does it say about us if we turn him away?" The question hung between them, uncomfortable in its directness. Victor glanced at the boy, who was now watching them with the hyper-awareness of a child accustomed to adult conflicts determining his fate. Something twisted in Victor's chest, recognition. Perhaps, or a memory he'd worked hard to suppress. "Where are his parents?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Just a dad, from what he said. And he doesn't know the kid is here." Miguel ran a hand through his hair. a rare gesture of frustration from the usually composed waiter. "Look, if someone needs to take the fall for this, it's me. Paolo was just helping because I asked." From across the kitchen, Paolo snorted without looking up from the pasta he was plating. "Don't be dramatic. We're feeding a hungry child, not robbing a bank." Victor felt trapped between his responsibility to enforce corporate policy and a growing sense that this situation required something policy manuals couldn't provide. He thought of the regional director's recent email praising Giovanni's efficiency and compliance record. He thought of the performance bonus that would help pay off the last of his student loans. He thought of how quickly one exception could become a pattern that jeopardized everything he'd worked for. Then he looked at Jamie again and instead saw himself at 8 years old, stomach growling in the night, too proud to tell his exhausted mother that the reduced-price lunch at school hadn't been enough. "What's your name, son?" Victor asked, approaching the boy while kitchen staff pretended not to watch. "Jamie, sir," the child answered, sitting up straighter. "Jamie Carter. And where's your dad think you are right now, Jamie?" A flash of guilt crossed the boy's face. "At the library. It's open late on Tuesdays for homework help." "Does your dad know you come here asking for food?" Jamie shook his head, eyes dropping to the floor. "He'd be mad if he knew. He says we don't take handouts." There was a fierce pride in the words that Victor recognized all too well. But he's been really tired since he lost his job, and sometimes he forgets about dinner. Paolo appeared with a steaming plate of fettuccine alfredo, not leftover scraps, but a fresh portion with extra chicken and a side of garlic bread still warm from the oven. "Eat," the chef said gruffly, placing the food in front of Jamie. "Food gets cold, tastes like sadness. Nobody wants that." Jamie looked to Victor, seeking permission, clearly aware that this man held authority over the unexpected kindness he'd been shown. The boy's hesitation, his instinctive understanding of hierarchies and power, struck Victor with unexpected force. Children shouldn't have to navigate such complexities just to eat. "Go ahead," Victor said, making a decision that felt both momentous and inevitable. "Enjoy your dinner." Relief broke across Jamie's face as he picked up the fork Paolo had provided. Victor turned to Miguel, who was watching with an expression that mingled surprise and something like respect. "This isn't a regular thing," Victor said firmly, maintaining at least the appearance of managerial authority. "And there are proper channels for handling situations like this." Miguel nodded, but there was a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement that sometimes humanity had to supersede policy. "Thank you," he said quietly. Victor straightened his tie, a habitual gesture when he felt off balance. "I'll be in my office. Make sure he gets something to drink with that meal." And Miguel, "Yes?" "Find out more about his situation, not just where he lives, but what they need." The words felt foreign in Victor's mouth, as if he were speaking a language he'd once known but long abandoned. "There might be resources we can connect them with." As Victor walked back to his office, he was already composing the mental script he'd use if corporate questioned this deviation from protocol. Food Waste Reduction Initiative, Community Goodwill Opportunity, potential, positive social media exposure. He'd find a way to frame this act of basic humanity in terms the bottom-line focused executives would accept. But beneath these pragmatic justifications, Victor confronted an uncomfortable truth. The carefully constructed walls between his past and present were beginning to crack, allowing long-buried emotions to seep through. In helping one hungry child, he might be forced to reckon with the hungry child he himself had once been, and all the choices he'd made to ensure he never felt that vulnerability again. The kitchen of Giovanni's was not designed for dining. Stainless steel countertops gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, the air thick with steam and the competing aromas of garlic, tomato sauce, and grilling meat. Noise echoed off the hard surfaces, the clatter of pots, the sizzle of pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the constant stream of orders called out in Chef Paolo's booming voice. Yet in this unlikely setting, Jamie sat on a high stool at the prep counter, experiencing perhaps the first moment of pure joy he'd known in months. The pasta before him wasn't half-eaten scraps, but a fresh, steaming plate of fettuccine Alfredo with tender pieces of chicken and bright green peas mixed throughout. The portion was enormous, enough to feed him for 2 days if he could have saved it. Beside the pasta sat a piece of garlic bread the size of his hand, butter soaking into the warm crust. Miguel placed a glass of chocolate milk next to the plate, a small extravagance that made Jamie's eyes widen. "Thought you might like something special with your dinner," the waiter said with a wink. Jamie hesitated only a moment before picking up his fork and taking his first bite. The rich, creamy sauce coated his tongue, the perfectly cooked pasta yielding between his teeth. He closed his eyes involuntarily, savoring the sensation of warm food filling his mouth, his stomach, his senses. "Good, yes?" Paulo asked, pausing in his orchestration of the dinner service to check on the small guest. Jamie nodded enthusiastically, his mouth too full for words. The chef grunted in satisfaction before returning to his work, but not before adding another piece of garlic bread to Jamie's plate with a quick, almost furtive movement. As Jamie ate, Miguel pulled up a stool beside him, giving the appearance of supervising while actually providing company. The kitchen staff worked around them, casting curious glances, but asking no questions. In the insular world of restaurant workers, solidarity often outweighed rule books. They had all seen the thin child with hungry eyes, and none would begrudge him a meal, regardless of policy. "Slow down a little," Miguel advised gently, as Jamie shoveled pasta into his mouth at a concerning rate. "There's no rush. Enjoy it." Jamie forced himself to take smaller bites, to chew more slowly, though every instinct urged him to consume as much as possible before this unexpected bounty was somehow rescinded. Hunger had taught him that food, like kindness, could be unpredictable in its availability. "How's school?" Miguel asked, keeping his tone casual, creating the illusion of normal dinner conversation in this most abnormal setting. Jamie swallowed before answering, his mother's long-ago lessons in manners surfacing through layers of more recent survival tactics. "It's okay. I like math. And reading. My son Mateo, he's about your age. He hates math but loves science. Anything with explosions." Miguel smiled, trying to put the boy at ease. "What grade are you in?" "Third, at Lincoln Elementary." Miguel nodded, filing away this information. Lincoln Elementary served one of the poorer neighborhoods in the city, an area that had been hit particularly hard by recent factory closures. "And your dad? What kind of work does he do?" Jamie's fork paused halfway to his mouth, wariness returning to his expression. "He used to fix cars at Jenkins Auto Shop, but it closed." The words came out clipped, protective. "He's looking for a new job. He goes out every day with his resume." Miguel recognized the fierce loyalty in Jamie's voice, the need to defend his father against implied criticism. "It's tough out there right now," he said. "Lots of places closing." Jamie relaxed slightly, sensing no judgment in Miguel's response. "Yeah, Dad says the economy's in a transition phase." He pronounced the words carefully, clearly quoting something he'd heard many times. "But things will get better soon." As Jamie returned to his meal, Miguel glanced up to find Paulo watching them, his usually gruff expression softened with concern. The chef beckoned Miguel over to his station, lowering his voice despite the kitchen's ambient noise. "The kid's been hungry a while," Paulo said. Not a question, but an observation from someone who knew the signs. "You can tell by how he eats, like he's storing it up," Miguel nodded. He'd noticed the same thing? The careful way Jamie wrapped his arm partially around his plate, the quick glances to check if anyone might take the food away, the methodical consumption that prioritized the most calorie-dense components first. "What's Victor going to do?" Paulo asked, his hands continuing to assemble a caprese salad even as his attention remained on the conversation. "He seemed different," Miguel admitted. almost like he's actually going to help instead of just enforcing policy. Paolo raised bushy eyebrows in surprise. Maybe our manager has a heart after all, tiny and frozen, but still beating somewhere in there. He told me to find out more about Jamie's situation, where he lives, what they need. The chef considered this while drizzling balsamic reduction over the salad with practiced precision. You know what this means. You've created a problem that needs solving. People like Victor, they can ignore suffering until it has a name, a face. Now, this hungry kid is Jamie, not just some abstract concept of poverty they can pretend doesn't exist. Before Miguel could respond, a commotion at the kitchen entrance drew their attention. Samantha, one of the servers, stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of excitement and alarm. "Guys," she said, her voice carrying across the kitchen. "There's a woman out front with her phone. She was recording when the kid asked for leftovers and when Miguel brought him back here. She's telling everyone at her table. It's going on her social media channel." A momentary silence fell over the kitchen as the implications sank in. In an age where videos could go viral within hours, where corporations monitored social media mentions, with algorithmic precision, their small act of kindness had suddenly acquired an audience. "Great," Paolo muttered. "Now corporate will definitely hear about this." Miguel looked back at Jamie, who continued eating, blissfully unaware of the potential storm brewing around his simple request for food. The boy had nearly finished his pasta, using the garlic bread to soak up the remaining sauce, his earlier desperation softened by the simple security of a full meal. "Let them hear," Miguel said, with a conviction that surprised even himself. Maybe they should see what happens in the real world outside their boardrooms. Across the kitchen, Jamie had finally slowed his eating, the desperate edge of hunger blunted by Paolo's generous portion. For perhaps the first time, he looked around with curiosity rather than caution, taking in the organized chaos of the professional. "Kitchen, is it always this busy?" he asked when Miguel returned to his side. "Tuesday nights are actually pretty calm," Miguel replied, resuming his seat. "You should see it on weekends," Jamie's eyes widened. "And you make all this food every day, even when people don't eat at all?" The question contained a child's genuine curiosity, but also a deeper awareness of waste that no 8-year-old should have to contemplate. Miguel felt a renewed surge of protectiveness toward this boy who had seen too much, understood too much about adult limitations. "Unfortunately, yes, we throw away a lot of food at the end of the night." Jamie considered this information with a seriousness that made him seem older than his years. "My dad says waste is disrespectful to the people who grew the food and to the people who can't afford it." "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Miguel said. Jamie nodded, pride momentarily overshadowing his caution. "He is. He knows about lots of things. He used to read to me every night before—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. "Before what, Jamie?" The boy shrugged, suddenly very interested in chasing the last bit of sauce around his plate. "Before he got so tired all the time." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken struggle, and Miguel felt his heart constrict with recognition. He knew intimately how poverty could exhaust not just the body, but the spirit, how it could steal small joys like bedtime stories and replace them with constant grinding worry. "Is there anything else you'd like?" Miguel asked, deliberately changing the subject to safer ground. "Paolo makes the best tiramisu in the city." Jamie's expression brightened, then fell. "I should probably go soon. The library closes at 8, and Dad will expect me home after that." "There's time for dessert," Miguel assured him, checking his watch. "And maybe we could give you something to take home for your dad." Hope and hesitation warred on Jamie's face. "Really? You'd do that?" "Of course. Everyone deserves dinner, Jamie." As if summoned by the conversation, Paolo appeared with a slice of tiramisu on a small plate and a paper bag that emitted the unmistakable aroma of fresh pasta. "Dessert for now," the chef said, placing the tiramisu before Jamie. "And lasagna for later. Good protein, reheats well." Jamie stared at these offerings with an expression that shifted between disbelief and a joy so pure it made Miguel's throat tighten. In the harsh fluorescent light of Giovanni's kitchen, surrounded by the controlled chaos of the dinner service, a small moment of grace had unfolded. Not just the feeding of a hungry child, but the recognition of his humanity, his worthiness of care. "Thank you," Jamie whispered, the words seemingly inadequate for the emotion behind them. "Thank you so much." Paulo waved away the thanks with gruff embarrassment, but Miguel saw the moisture in the chef's eyes before he turned abruptly. Back to his station. In that moment, Miguel understood that what had begun as a simple act of kindness had become something more, a ripple disturbing the surface of comfortable ignorance, forcing everyone involved to see not just hunger, but the child experiencing it, not just policy, but the humanity it ignored, and now with a stranger's phone potentially broadcasting their small revolution to the wider world, those ripples might spread far beyond Giovanni's kitchen. David Carter sat at the kitchen table of apartment 3B, surrounded by a fortress of paper. Job applications, rejection letters, past due notices, and medical bills formed precarious stacks that threatened to topple with each frustrated sigh. The apartment was quiet except for the persistent drip of the bathroom faucet and the occasional rumble of the ancient refrigerator, a sound that had become more worrying in recent weeks. At 41, David had never imagined he would be here, unemployed for 3 months, savings depleted, refrigerator nearly empty, and worst of all, failing. The one person who depended on him completely. He ran a hand through hair that had begun graying at the temples the year his wife died. The same year, the chronic back pain from an old construction injury had forced him to find gentler work as an auto mechanic. "Just need one break," he muttered, circling another job listing with a pen that was running out of ink. "Just one damn break." His eyes drifted to the photograph propped against the sugar bowl. Jamie at 6, grinning with Sarah at the state fair, cotton candy sticking to both. Their faces. Sarah's eyes crinkled at the corners in that way that had always made David's heart flip even after 12 years of marriage. What would she think of him now? Of the mess he'd made of their lives since cancer took her with a swiftness that still left him breathless when he thought about it. David checked his watch, 7:30 p.m. Jamie would be heading home from the library. Soon, the library, with its free internet, heat in the winter, air conditioning in the summer, and most importantly, the free after-school homework help program that Jamie had been attending since David could no longer afford their internet service. Yet another failure to add to his growing list. With a sigh, he pushed himself away from the table and opened the refrigerator, taking inventory of their dwindling supplies. Half a loaf of bread, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, 2 eggs, a splash of milk and condiment bottles lined the door. The cupboards were equally sparse, a box of pasta, some canned vegetables, a packet of ramen noodles. Breakfast for dinner it is, David decided, pulling out the eggs. He could make them stretch with the last bit of bread toasted and divided between them. Tomorrow he would need to swallow his pride and visit the food bank, something he'd been putting off despite the social worker's repeated suggestions. The thought of standing in line, accepting handouts, made his stomach clench with a shame so intense it was almost physical. He had been raised to believe that a man provided for his family, that hard work always paid off, that asking for help was a last resort for the truly desperate. Well, here he was, truly desperate, and still resisting the inevitable. Was it pride or stubbornness, or some toxic mixture of both? Whatever it was, it had to yield to the reality of Jamie's growing body and persistent hunger. As he cracked an egg into a bowl, David's thoughts drifted back to the last job interview he'd had. Assistant manager at an auto parts store. The position paid less than his mechanic job had, but it offered stability and health insurance, 2 things he desperately needed. He'd worn his only suit, had practiced answers to common interview questions, had arrived 15 minutes early. The Interview had gone well until they asked about his recent employment gap. David had explained about Jenkins' auto shop closing, had offered references who would vouch for his work ethic and skill. The interviewer had nodded sympathetically, made notes, promised to be in touch. The rejection email had arrived 3 days. Later, a politely worded form letter, thanking him for his interest. The sound of a key in the lock interrupted David's bitter reflections. He quickly wiped his face, pasting on the smile he always wore for Jamie, regardless of circumstances. "Hey, buddy, how was the library?" Jamie entered the apartment clutching his backpack and what appeared to be a takeout bag, his expression caught between excitement and apprehension. "It was good. I finished all my homework." David nodded approvingly, even as he eyed the paper bag with confusion. "What's that you've got there?" Jamie set his backpack down carefully before approaching the kitchen table, moving aside a stack of papers to place the bag in the cleared space. A really nice man at the restaurant gave it to me." A cold feeling settled in David's stomach. What restaurant, Jamie? And what man? His tone must have betrayed his alarm because Jamie's shoulders hunched slightly, his voice growing smaller. "Giovanni's on Maple Street. I was walking past after the library, and it smelled so good, and I just looked in the window for a minute, that's all." David struggled to keep his expression neutral despite the panic rising in his chest. "And someone just gave you food? For nothing? You know we don't accept." "I know, Dad. We don't take handouts." Jamie's voice took on the rote quality of a frequently repeated lesson. "But the waiter, Miguel, he was really nice. And the chef made it fresh just for me. And they said it was for you too." The words tumbled out faster as Jamie tried to explain. "They were going to throw away so much food anyway, and I was just looking. But then my stomach made that really loud noise and—" "Jamie!" David cut him off, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he let his son continue. With careful movements, he opened the bag, revealing a foil container that, when opened, released the rich aroma of lasagna. Enough for at least 2 meals, topped with melted cheese and fresh herbs. His mouth watered involuntarily even as his pride writhed in protest. "They were really nice, Dad," Jamie repeated, watching his father's face with the hypervigilance of a child who had learned to read adult emotions as a survival skill. "The chef said it would reheat well, and I already ate there, so this is just for you. So it's not really a handout, more like leftovers." David closed his eyes briefly, wrestling with colliding emotions. Shame at having a child who needed to justify accepting food from strangers. Anger at a world that had reduced them to this. And beneath it all, a gnawing hunger that made the lasagna's aroma almost painfully enticing. "Come here, buddy," he said, finally opening his arms. Jamie approached cautiously, then melted into his father's embrace when it became clear David wasn't angry. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered against David's shoulder. "I know we're not supposed to ask for help." David held his son tighter, suddenly aware of how thin the small body felt in his arms. Had Jamie lost weight? How had he not noticed? "No, I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I haven't been. I should have." Words failed him as the full weight of their situation pressed down with crushing force. He had been so focused on finding work, on maintaining some illusion of normalcy, that he'd failed to see what was directly in front of him. His child was hungry enough to ask strangers for food. What kind of father did that make him? "It's not your fault, Dad," Jamie said, with the terrible maturity of children who grow up too quickly in the face of adult problems. "You're doing your best. I know that." David released his son, wiping quickly at his eyes before Jamie could see the tears threatening to spill over. "Let's have some of this lasagna, huh? No sense letting it go to waste." As he heated the food in their temperamental microwave, David watched Jamie set the table with their mismatched plates, his movements careful and precise. When had his son become so self-sufficient, so conscious of adult concerns? Jamie shouldn't have to worry about food or money, or whether approaching a stranger for help might make his father feel like a failure. He should be thinking about video games and sports and whatever else 8-year-old boys were into these days. The microwave beeped and David divided the lasagna, a larger portion for Jamie. Though he tried to make it look even, they sat across from each other at the table, cleared of its depressing paperwork, the rich aroma of tomato sauce and cheese filling their small kitchen. "This smells amazing," David said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "Tell me about this restaurant. Did you see how they make the pasta?" As Jamie launched into an animated description of Giovanni's kitchen, David took his first bite of the lasagna and nearly groaned aloud. It was, without question, the best thing he'd eaten in months. Layers of pasta, meat sauce, ricotta, and perfectly melted mozzarella. For a brief moment, the constant knot of anxiety in his chest loosened, allowing him to simply enjoy the food and his son's excitement. And the chef, Paolo, he's from Italy, and he said real Italian food is about simplicity, not fancy ingredients, Jamie continued between eager bites. And Miguel, the waiter, he has a son my age named Matteo who hates math but loves science. David listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, while a new worry formed in the back of his mind. His son had spent enough time with these strangers to learn their names, their stories. In his hunger and desperation, Jamie had reached out to people David knew nothing about. The thought was terrifying, not because he truly believed anyone at the restaurant meant harm, but because it highlighted how vulnerable their situation had made them. "Dad," Jamie's voice pulled David from his troubled thoughts. "Are you mad at me for going to the restaurant?" Christina Zhao had not intended to become an activist. As a marketing executive with a passion for food photography, her social media presence had been carefully curated to showcase artfully arranged plates from trendy restaurants, not to spark social movements. Her 60,000 followers came for the aesthetic shots of deconstructed desserts and insider reviews of up-and-coming chefs, not political commentary on food insecurity. But sometimes life places you at exactly the right place with exactly the right tools to capture a moment that changes everything. Christina had been at Giovanni's that Tuesday evening for a simple reason. Their carbonara was exceptional and photographed beautifully under the restaurant's warm lighting. She'd been midway through arranging her plate for the perfect shot when the small drama began unfolding at the table next to hers. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the boy's voice, so carefully polite, so desperately hopeful, had cut through. The ambient restaurant noise with heartbreaking clarity. "Excuse me, sir, are you going to throw that away? Because if you are, I was wondering if maybe I could have it instead." Instinct had her reaching for her phone, switching from camera to video mode as the waiter, Miguel, according to his name tag, hesitated with the half-eaten plate of pasta in his hand. Something in his expression, in the gentle way he spoke, to the child told Christina this was more than just a routine interaction. When Miguel led the boy toward the kitchen instead of the door, she kept recording, capturing the manager's concerned follow-up and the curious glances of nearby diners. What happened next surprised even Christina, who considered herself a savvy user of social media. She posted the video to her accounts with a simple caption: "Witnessed something at Giovanni's tonight that restored my faith in humanity. A hungry child, a compassionate waiter, a choice between policy and kindness. What would you do on food insecurity? Humanity matters." By the time she'd finished her tiramisu, the video had been shared 300 times. By midnight, the count had reached 12,000, with comments flooding in from around the country and beyond. This broke me that poor baby shouldn't have to ask for leftovers. Give that waiter a raise immediately. Standing ovation for Miguel. Wonder what corporate policy says about this. Betting they're not happy. The manager's face when they went to the kitchen. Priceless. Why isn't our society taking care of hungry children in the richest country in the world? By Wednesday morning, As Christina scrolled through notification after notification on her phone, she realized she had inadvertently ignited something that went far beyond one restaurant interaction. The video had tapped into a vein of collective emotion about childhood hunger, corporate policies, and simple human kindness in a world often perceived as increasingly callous. News outlets began reaching out, requesting permission to use the footage. Local stations first, then national. Hashtags emerged. Giovanni Kindness, Ja Feed the Kids, Leftovers Love Movement. Someone identified the restaurant chain, and Giovanni's corporate social media accounts were flooded with comments ranging from praise for the employees to scathing critiques of company policies that would discourage feeding hungry children. In the eye of this digital storm, Miguel Alvarez awoke Wednesday morning to a string of text messages from co-workers, all variations on the same theme. Have you seen what's happening online? He hadn't. Social media had never been a significant part of Miguel's life. His flip phone couldn't handle apps, and between his 2 jobs and family responsibilities, he had little time for scrolling through feeds. But as message after message arrived, he borrowed his teenage daughter's smartphone to see what had caused such a commotion. The video was everywhere. On news sites, on social platforms, embedded in blog posts analyzing corporate responsibility and food waste. There he was, frozen in that moment of decision with Jamie, his internal struggle visible on his face before he made the choice that now had strangers around the world calling him a hero. Dios mío, he whispered, sinking onto the edge of his bed. Elena appeared in the doorway of their small bedroom, concern etched on her face. What is it? What's wrong? Miguel handed her the phone wordlessly, watching as her expression shifted from worry to surprise, to a complicated mixture of pride and fear. Will you lose your job? She asked finally, voicing the question that had kept him awake much of the night. I don't know, he admitted. Victor seemed different yesterday, almost supportive. But this? He gestured at the phone, where the view count on the original video now exceeded 2 million. This changes things. Elena sat beside him, taking his hand. Whatever happens, you did the right thing. That boy was hungry, and you fed him. How can anyone say that's wrong? Miguel squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty. I should call Victor, find out if I should come in for my shift tonight. Before he could reach for the phone, it buzzed with an incoming call. Victor's number. Miguel and Elena exchanged glances before he answered, his voice carefully neutral. Hello? Have you seen it? Victor asked without preamble. The video? Yes, just now. A heavy sigh came through the line. Corporate called an emergency meeting. 9 a.m. conference call with regional directors and the PR team. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They're concerned about the optics. Miguel's heart sank. The optics sounded like corporate speak for damage control, for distancing the brand from an embarrassing situation. What does that mean for me, for Paolo? I don't know yet, Victor admitted. I've been instructed not to make any statements to the press. Same goes for you and the rest of the staff. Direct all inquiries to corporate communications. And my shift tonight? Another pause, longer this time. Come in as scheduled, but Miguel, be prepared. This situation is unprecedented. After they hung up, Miguel sat in silence, Elena's comforting hand on his shoulder. Unprecedented. The word seemed inadequate for what was unfolding, a simple act of kindness spinning out into a viral phenomenon with potentially life-changing consequences. Across town, in his corner office with its carefully cultivated plants and motivational posters, Victor Daniels was navigating the most challenging day of his managerial career. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m. when the regional director had called, voice tight, with controlled panic, to inform him that Giovanni's was trending on multiple platforms and the corporate communications team was assessing the situation. Now, as he prepared for the conference call, Victor found himself in the unusual position of defending actions that technically violated company policy. He had spent years building his reputation as a by-the-book manager who consistently delivered results through strict adherence to corporate guidelines. Yet here he was, about to argue for compassion over compliance, humanity over handbook rules. On his computer screen, the video played on mute, a visual reminder of the moment everything changed. He watched himself in the background, expression shifting from annoyance to concern as Miguel led Jamie to the kitchen. What had the videographer captured in his face? What were millions of strangers seeing when they watched this footage? The conference call was exactly as uncomfortable as Victor had anticipated. Jennifer from corporate communications spoke first, her voice professionally pleasant, but underlaid with tension. As you're all aware, we're dealing with a significant social media situation involving our Maple Street location. A video showing one of our servers apparently taking a child into the kitchen area has gone viral with predominantly negative commentary regarding our policies on food waste and community engagement. Predominantly negative. Victor almost laughed at the understatement. He had seen the comments before, forcing himself to stop reading. Thousands of people expressing outrage that a restaurant would even hesitate to feed a hungry child. Calls for boycotts until Giovanni's changed its policies. Demands that the employees involved be rewarded rather than punished. Our initial response will emphasize our long-standing commitment to food safety regulations that prohibit unauthorized persons in food preparation areas, Jennifer continued. We'll also highlight our existing charitable partnerships with food banks in select markets. Victor found himself speaking before he'd fully formulated his thoughts. With all due respect, Jennifer, that approach might backfire spectacularly. Silence fell over the call, the kind that indicated surprised executives exchanging glances in conference rooms miles apart. Could you elaborate, Victor? Regional Director Mark Peterson's voice held a warning note. Victor took a deep breath. The public isn't seeing a food safety violation. They're seeing a hungry child and employees who chose compassion over rigid rules. If we lead with policy justifications, we'll come across as heartless corporate automatons, more concerned with liability than humanity. What would you suggest instead? Jennifer asked, her tone suggesting she was taking notes, but not necessarily in agreement. Victor surprised himself with the clarity of his response, acknowledged that our employees showed exceptional humanity in an unusual situation, announce a review of our policies regarding food waste and community support, perhaps even launch an initiative to address childhood food insecurity in our operating areas that would represent a significant pivot in our corporate messaging, Mark observed, neither approving nor rejecting the suggestion. Miguel's shift had ended 2 hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to go home yet. The day had been surreal, customers requesting his section specifically, leaving oversized tips with notes like, "Thank you for your humanity," scrawled on receipts, a few even asking for photos with the waiter from the video. Through it all, Victor had maintained a strained composure, fielding calls from corporate, between directing the floor staff and politely, but firmly, turning away the reporters who continued to gather outside. "You should go home, get some rest," Victor said, finding Miguel in the break room, staring into a cold cup of coffee. "Tomorrow will be busy too." Miguel looked up, surprised to find genuine concern in his manager's expression. "I keep thinking about Jamie," he admitted. "All this attention, all these people suddenly caring about hungry kids. But what about that specific hungry kid? Is he okay tonight? Does he have dinner?" Victor sat across from him, tie loosened, and shirt wrinkled after the longest Wednesday either of them could remember. "You're thinking of trying to find him." It wasn't a question, but Miguel nodded anyway. He mentioned Lincoln Elementary and walking distance to the library on Maple. That narrows it down to a few neighborhoods. It could be seen as overstepping, Victor cautioned, though without his usual authoritative tone. The father might not appreciate the attention. Miguel considered this, remembering Jamie's careful explanation that his father didn't know he was asking for food, the pride evident even in how an 8-year-old described their situation. Maybe, but I can't just do nothing." Victor studied him for a long moment before reaching into his pocket. He withdrew his wallet and pulled out several bills, more cash than Miguel would make in tips during an average shift. "If you find them, they might need more than just one meal." Miguel stared at the offered money, momentarily speechless. "Victor, I can't." "Consider it an advance on the raise you deserve, but corporate hasn't approved yet," Victor interrupted, a hint of his old briskness returning. "Just let me know what you find out. If there's more, we can do." 20 minutes later, Miguel parked his aging sedan on a street lined with apartment buildings that had seen better days. Lincoln Heights, once a solidly middle-class neighborhood, that had declined as factories closed and better-paying jobs disappeared. The elementary school sat at one end of the district, the public library at the other, with these apartment complexes clustered in between. "If I were walking from the library to Giovanni's," Miguel murmured to himself, tracing the route on a mental map, "I'd take Maple to Elm, then cut through." He drove slowly, eyes scanning buildings, trying to imagine which one might house Jamie and his father. At the third complex, a 3-story brick building with a sagging front stoop, Miguel noticed a small figure sitting on the steps, head bent over a book. Even in the fading light, he recognized Jamie's too thin frame and careful posture. Miguel parked and approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy. "Jamie," the child's head snapped up, wariness instantly replacing concentration. When he recognized Miguel, his expression cycled rapidly through surprise, pleasure, and concern. "Miguel, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," Miguel said simply, stopping a respectful distance away. "Make sure you're okay after everything." Jamie glanced nervously at the building behind him. "My dad doesn't know. About yesterday, about the restaurant." Miguel nodded, understanding the implication. "I won't say anything if you don't want me to, but Jamie, if you and your dad need help, there are ways to get it. Ways that don't involve asking strangers for leftovers." The boy's shoulders hunched slightly. "Dad says we don't take handouts." "It's not handouts," Miguel said gently. "It's community. It's people helping each other through tough times." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "My family needed help once too, when we first came to this country. Food banks, assistance with rent, hand-me-down clothes for my kids. It's not forever, just until things get better." Jamie seemed to consider this, his young face serious beyond his years. "Dad's been really sad since Mom died, and really tired. He looks for jobs every day, but it's tough out there right now," Miguel agreed, repeating what he'd said in the restaurant. "Would it be okay if I talked to your dad, just to introduce myself?" Fear flashed across Jamie's features. "He'll be mad if he knows I asked for food." "I won't mention that part," Miguel promised. "I'll just say I met you near the library and wanted to say hello." After a moment's hesitation, Jamie nodded and led the way into the building. The hallway smelled of old cooking oil and stronger odors Miguel chose not to identify. Peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of neglect that matched the building's exterior. They climbed to the 3rd floor, Jamie moving with the unconscious ease of habit, while Miguel noted the broken handrail and missing light fixtures. Apartment 3B's door was distinguished by a small hand-drawn sign reading Carter Residence in careful block letters. Jamie knocked rather than using a key, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a tall man with tired eyes and the wary expression Miguel had come to recognize in Jamie's own features. "Dad, this is Miguel," Jamie said quickly. "He works at a restaurant near the library. I met him yesterday when he was on break outside." Miguel silently blessed the boy for his quick thinking, extending his hand with what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Miguel Alvarez. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carter." "David," the man corrected automatically, shaking Miguel's hand with a firm grip that spoke of pride not yet eroded by circumstance. Jamie didn't mention meeting anyone new. The subtle question hung in the air as David's eyes moved between his son and this unexpected visitor. Miguel maintained his smile while rapidly recalibrating his approach. The apartment visible behind David was small but meticulously clean, its sparse furnishings arranged with care. Not a home of neglect then, but of scarcity, managed with dignity. Noticed Jamie reading by himself near the library, Miguel improvised, careful to keep his tone casual. My son Mateo is about the same age, also loves books. We got talking about his current read, Percy Jackson, right? Jamie nodded, gratitude visible in his eyes at the smoothly delivered fiction. Anyway, Miguel continued, I was in the neighborhood dropping off some food for a church pantry program and thought I'd say hello. David's posture relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. That's neighborly of you. Actually, Miguel said, seizing the opening, the pantry's looking for volunteers for their weekend distribution. Nothing fancy, just helping. Organize donations, maybe delivering to folks who can't make it in person. They're short-handed lately. I'm pretty busy with the job search, David said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Miguel nodded sympathetically. Of course. Tough market right now. What field are you in? Automotive. I was a mechanic at Jenkins until they closed down. No kidding. My brother-in-law works at Martinez Auto on the west side. They were looking for someone with experience. Last I heard, a flash of interest crossed David's face before caution reasserted itself. I appreciate the information, but Dad, Jamie interrupted, with the directness only children can manage, I'm hungry. Can Miguel stay for dinner? We could share. David's expression cycled through embarrassment, pride, and resignation so quickly, Miguel might have missed it if he hadn't been watching closely. Jamie, I'm sure Mr. Alvarez has his own family waiting. Actually, my wife's visiting her mother with the kids tonight, Miguel said, the lie coming easily in service of what he now recognized as a critical moment. I was just going to grab something on the way home, but I'd love to join you, if it's not an imposition. Before David could respond, Miguel reached into the canvas bag he'd brought from the restaurant, the one that actually did contain food, though not for any church pantry. I picked up a few things earlier. Nothing fancy, just some pasta, sauce, garlic bread. Maybe we could cook together? He held out the bag, careful to present it as casual sharing between neighbors rather than charity. David hesitated, conflict visible in the tight line of his jaw. Miguel recognized the expression intimately, the internal war between pride and practicality, between the desire to maintain independence and the undeniable needs of a hungry child. We haven't had Italian in a while, David said finally, stepping back to allow Miguel entry. Jamie, set another place at the table, please. The small apartment revealed more about the Carters' situation than David might have intended. The kitchen cabinet stood open and mostly empty. A stack of past-due notices sat on the counter, partially covered by a newspaper, open to the classified section. School artwork decorated the refrigerator, Jamie's drawings providing color in a space otherwise defined by utility and restraint. As Miguel unpacked the bag, which contained considerably more than just pasta and sauce, including a container of Paolo's signature meatballs and a carefully wrapped tiramisu, he maintained a stream of casual conversation about the neighborhood, local sports teams, anything to normalize the situation and ease the tension evident in David's rigid posture. Jamie tells me you're quite the reader, Miguel said, nodding toward the boy who was carefully arranging 3 mismatched plates on the small kitchen table. Mateo struggles with reading, more of a hands-on kid. The headquarters of Italian Delights Incorporated, parent company of Giovanni's restaurant chain, occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office tower in Chicago's business district. The boardroom on the top floor featured floor-to-ceiling windows, offering spectacular views of Lake Michigan, though none of the 12 executives seated around the polished mahogany table were admiring the scenery this morning. 3 days, CEO Richard Harmon said, tapping a manicured finger on the printout. Before him, 3 days, and this video has been viewed 27 million times. Our mentions are up 4,000%. We've received inquiries from every major news outlet in the country. He looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and calculation. All because one of our waiters gave a sandwich to a kid. Pasta, corrected Melissa Chen, Chief Marketing Officer. Fettuccine Alfredo to be precise. And it wasn't just that he gave the child food, it was the context. The boy asked for leftovers about to be thrown away. And instead of giving him scraps, our employees prepared him a fresh meal, in violation of at least 3 company policies, noted Howard Jenkins, legal counsel, without looking up from his tablet. Unauthorized persons in food preparation areas, giving away product without payment, potential liability issues if the child had alleged any illness afterward. Melissa shot him an exasperated look. Howard, read the room. The public doesn't care about our policies. They care that a hungry child was fed. The optics of emphasizing policy violations would be catastrophic. The optics are already challenging, Richard observed dryly. Hashtags calling us heartless. Corporate overlords, people sharing their own stories of hunger, celebrities tweeting about childhood food insecurity and tagging us. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Not exactly the brand association we've been cultivating. Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably. Italian Delights Incorporated had spent millions positioning Giovanni's as an upscale yet accessible dining experience. Authentic Italian flavor for America's families was their current tagline. Nowhere in their carefully crafted brand identity was there room for the messy reality of childhood poverty intersecting with corporate food waste policies. Our initial statement clearly wasn't sufficient, Melissa said, referring to the brief acknowledgement they'd released the previous day. Social media response has been overwhelmingly negative. Terms like tone deaf and corporate doublespeak are trending alongside our brand name. Richard nodded grimly. Recommendations? Lean into it, Melissa said without hesitation. Acknowledge that our employees showed exceptional humanity. Announce a comprehensive review of our food waste policies. Partner with a national organization addressing childhood hunger. Costs? Asked Frank Miller, CFO, predictably. Melissa was prepared. Minimal compared to the potential damage to our brand if we mishandle this. We're talking about a public relations opportunity that money literally cannot buy. Authentic emotional connection with consumers, the kind of goodwill that translates directly to customer loyalty. Are you and the employees involved? Richard asked. This waiter, Miguel, and the others? An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Company policy was clear about the violations that had occurred. Standard procedure would involve at minimum a formal reprimand, possibly termination, particularly given the public nature of the incident. If we discipline them, it will leak to the press, Melissa stated flatly. The public backlash would be immediate and severe. We'd be confirming every negative stereotype about soulless corporations valuing policy over people. So we reward policy violations? Howard asked, skepticism evident in his tone. That creates its own precedent issues. Richard held up a hand, silencing the brewing debate. What about this manager, Victor Daniels? The Maple Street location has been one of our top performers for years. Consistently excellent numbers, minimal staff turnover. How has he handled the situation? Melissa consulted her notes. Surprisingly well, actually. He's kept the restaurant running smoothly despite media presence outside. Staff report he's been supportive of Miguel rather than punitive. He even suggested to corporate communications that we use this as an opportunity to reassess our community engagement approach. Richard raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like the by-the-book manager described in his performance reviews. People can surprise you, Melissa said with a small smile, especially when forced to confront the human consequences of corporate policies. After another hour of discussion, a consensus emerged. Not the unanimous agreement Richard preferred, but a workable compromise between the various departmental concerns. Melissa was tasked with drafting a more substantive public statement, while the operations team would begin reviewing food donation possibilities that wouldn't run afoul of health regulations or liability concerns. And the employees? Howard asked. As the meeting concluded, Richard considered for a moment. No disciplinary action. In fact, prepare a formal commendation for their, what did you call it, Melissa? Exceptional humanity, she supplied. Yes, that. Richard gathered his papers, effectively ending the discussion. Sometimes exceptions to policy are exactly what a company needs to remember its own humanity. As the executives filed out, Richard remained seated, staring at the printed still from the viral video. A frozen moment capturing Miguel's face as he made the decision that would ultimately force a multinational corporation to reconsider its priorities. There was something in the waiter's expression that had resonated with millions of viewers, something authentic that no marketing campaign could manufacture. Richard made a mental note to visit the Maple Street location personally. Some situations required a leader's direct attention, not just delegated solutions. 300 miles away from the corporate deliberations, Victor Daniels sat in his office at Giovanni's, phone pressed to his ear as he absorbed the latest update. From Regional Director Mark Peterson. So, no disciplinary action? Victor confirmed, hardly believing what he was hearing. For any of the staff involved? Not only that, Mark replied, an unusual note of approval in his typically neutral tone. Corporate is sending formal commendations. Apparently, the marketing team considers this a brand authenticity opportunity or some such language. Victor almost laughed at the corporate jargon, transforming basic human decency into a marketing strategy. And the policy reviews, the community engagement initiatives, all moving forward, Mark assured him. Melissa Chen has taken personally interest in the situation. Between us, when marketing gets this excited about something, budget tends to follow. After ending the call, Victor sat back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of relief. The past 3 days had been the most challenging of his managerial career, balancing the operational needs of a restaurant suddenly thrust into the spotlight, supporting staff dealing with unwanted attention, and navigating corporate's evolving response to the situation. Through it all, he'd found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. Long dormant aspects of his personality, compassion, flexibility, moral courage, had reasserted themselves, pushing against the rigid professional persona he'd cultivated over years of corporate advancement. A knock at his office door interrupted these reflections. Miguel stood in the doorway, his expression guarded. "You wanted to see me?" "Come in," Victor said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I just got off the phone with Regional. Corporate has made their decision." Miguel sat stiffly, his hands clasped in his lap. Despite everything, he still expected punishment for breaking the rules, a reality that suddenly struck Victor as profoundly sad. What kind of workplace culture had he helped create, where an employee expected to be? Penalized for an act of basic humanity? "You're receiving a formal commendation," Victor said, watching surprise bloom across Miguel's face. "All of you, Paolo, even me, apparently. Corporate is reviewing food waste policies and exploring partnerships with hunger relief organizations." Miguel's shoulders sagged with relief. "Really? No disciplinary action?" "None," Victor confirmed. "In fact, there's talk of featuring you in their revised community engagement strategy, if you're comfortable with that." Miguel considered this, his expression thoughtful. "If it helps change things for the better, I'm willing. But what about Jamie and his dad? Has there been any more thought about helping them specifically?" The question caught Victor off guard, though it shouldn't have. While he and corporate had been focused on managing the public relations aspect of the situation, Miguel had remained concerned with the human beings at its center. "You mentioned visiting them last night," Victor said. "How are they doing?" Miguel shared what he'd learned about the Carters, David's employment situation, Jamie's resilience, their precarious financial circumstances made more challenging by pride and grief. I connected David with my brother-in-law at Martinez Auto, but there's no guarantee they'll hire him. And even if they do, it will be weeks before his first paycheck. Victor nodded, making notes. What do they need most immediately? Food security, rent assistance, maybe help with job applications. David's been applying online, but he doesn't have reliable internet access. And Jamie, Miguel hesitated. Jamie needs to be a kid again, to not worry about where his next meal is coming from. Rachel Torres had owned Sunshine Bakery for 17 years, weathering economic downturns, changing neighborhood demographics, and the rise of trendy chain cafes with their identical pastries and standardized coffee drinks. Her small shop on Elm Street had survived by becoming more than just a business. It was a community hub where locals gathered for morning coffee, where families ordered birthday cakes, where the neighborhood stories were shared across worn, wooden tables. So when she saw the viral video of Jamie asking for leftovers at Giovanni's, she didn't just see a marketing opportunity or a social media moment. She saw a child from her own community going hungry, while businesses around him threw away food. And Rachel Torres was not a woman who could know such a thing and do nothing. It's absolutely ridiculous, she declared to her small staff during their morning meeting. We donate day-old bread and pastries to the senior center already. Why aren't more businesses doing something similar? And why isn't there better coordination? To get food to families who need it? Her assistant manager, Tanya, nodded agreement. My cousin works at that grocery store on Maple. Says they throw out produce that doesn't look perfect, dairy products approaching sell-by dates, perfectly good food, just not sellable by their standards. That's what I'm talking about, Rachel exclaimed, her indignation growing. We need to do something. Not just a one-time donation, but something sustainable, something that addresses the actual problem. By noon, Rachel had made 17 phone calls to other local business owners. By closing time, she had convened an impromptu meeting in her bakery's back room, where representatives from 12 businesses gathered around tables still dusted with flour from the day's baking. We all saw the video, Rachel began without preamble. A child in our community was hungry enough to ask strangers for food they were throwing away. That's not just Giovanni's problem. That's our problem, all of ours. Heads nodded around the tables. These were small business owners who knew their customers by name, who lived and worked in the same neighborhood. They might compete for dollars, but they shared a sense of responsibility to the community that sustained them. So, what are you suggesting? Asked Ahmad from the hardware store. Rachel smiled, pulling out the clipboard she'd been scribbling on between customers all day. I have some ideas. Across town in the conference room of Martinez Auto Repair, Jose Martinez was having a similar conversation with his staff. Miguel's call about David Carter had resonated with him, not just because Miguel was family, but because Jose himself had once been unemployed with children to feed. He remembered the grinding anxiety, the erosion of self-worth, the desperate search for work that paid enough to cover basic necessities. We've been looking for an experienced mechanic, Jose told his team. This guy, David, has the qualifications. He just needs a chance. But we were going to wait until next quarter to hire anyone, his office manager reminded him. The budget, some things are more important than quarterly budgets, Jose interrupted. Besides, if he's as good as his references say, he'll more than pay for himself in increased efficiency. The conversation shifted to practical matters. When David could interview, what projects needed immediate attention, how to onboard a new team member effectively. But beneath these details ran a current of shared understanding. Sometimes business decisions needed to be guided by more than just bottom-line considerations. Similar scenes were unfolding throughout the city as the video continued to circulate, touching something fundamental in viewers. At the public library, staff discussed creating food pantry space in their community room. At Lincoln Elementary, teachers quietly started a backpack program to send food home with students who might otherwise go hungry over weekends. At places of worship, congregations organized meal trains and grocery deliveries for families experiencing food insecurity. What made these efforts remarkable wasn't just their spontaneity, but their interconnectedness. Rachel's meeting of business owners led to conversations with the library director, who connected with school administrators, who reached out to social services. Within days, a network was forming, informal at first, but rapidly developing structure and purpose. At the center of this growing movement, though few realized it yet, was Victor Daniels. The Giovanni's manager had spent years cultivating professional relationships throughout the business community. Now he leveraged those connections with singular focus, making introductions, suggesting collaborations, quietly guiding resources toward effective use. "We need a more coordinated approach," he explained during a call with Rachel Torres and other key organizers. "Giovanni's corporate is committing resources, but they need local partners who understand the community's specific needs." "What exactly is corporate offering?" Rachel asked, the practical business owner in her needing specifics. Before making commitments, Victor had prepared for this question. Financial support for immediate needs, logistics expertise for food distribution, physical space for events, and they're developing a broader initiative that could be replicated in other locations if we demonstrate success here. What Victor didn't mention was how many hours he'd spent on conference calls convincing executives that this level of commitment was necessary, or how he'd put his own career on the line by advocating for resources beyond what corporate initially approved. Some battles were better left unmentioned, their scars visible only to those who had fought them. As the community's response gathered momentum, Miguel found himself in an unexpected role as liaison between the Carters and the growing network of support. It was a delicate position, requiring him to balance David's fierce pride against Jamie's immediate needs, to translate offers of help into forms David could accept without feeling diminished. "It's not charity," Miguel explained during one difficult conversation in the Carters' apartment. "Martinez Auto genuinely needs an experienced mechanic. They're offering you an interview because of your qualifications, not because they feel sorry for you." David remained skeptical, years of rejection having taught him to expect disappointment. And all these other people suddenly wanting to help? The food donations, the job fair, the offer to fix our internet? "You're telling me that's not because of some viral video?" Miguel chose his words carefully. "Did you know Rachel Torres at Sunshine Bakery has been donating day-old bread to the senior center for years? That the library has had a homework help program since before Jamie was born? That Jose Martinez started his business with a loan from his community after banks turned him down?" He paused, letting these examples sink in. What's happening now isn't new charity. It's people remembering that we're supposed to take care of each other. Something in this framing seemed to reach David, perhaps because it aligned with values he himself held dear. "I've always tried to help others when I could," he said quietly. "Before things got so bad, I used to volunteer at Sarah's school, fixing things around the building. Never occurred to me that I'd be the one needing help someday." "That's how community works," Miguel said simply. "Sometimes you give help, sometimes you receive it. The important thing is that no one faces hard times alone." Gradually, David's resistance softened. He agreed to the interview at Martinez Auto. He allowed Jamie to participate in the library's new after-school program, which coincidentally included a substantial snack. He even, with considerable reluctance, accepted assistance completing applications for temporary support programs that would help bridge the gap until he was financially stable again. For Jamie, these changes manifested in tangible improvements: a refrigerator that contained more than condiments, a father less consumed by worry, a community that suddenly seemed to see him as more than just a problem to be solved. The careful vigilance that had become his default expression began to relax, allowing glimpses of the carefree child he might have been under different circumstances. "Dad says I might be able to join the soccer team next season," he told Miguel during one of the waiter's now regular visits. "If he gets the job at Martinez Auto, and if they have scholarships for the fees." That sounds great," Miguel replied, noting with approval the increased confidence in Jamie's voice, the way he spoke of the future as something to look forward to rather than something to fear. "I bet you'll be an excellent player." "I'm pretty fast," Jamie said, with the first trace of boastfulness Miguel had heard from him, a healthy sign in a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "And Dad used to play in high school. He said he'd practice with me on weekends." These small victories, a child excited about soccer, a father planning weekend activities, a community recognizing its capacity to care for its vulnerable members, might seem insignificant against the backdrop of systemic issues like poverty and food insecurity. But to those involved, they represented something profound, the recognition that genuine change begins not with grand policies, but with individual choices, to see others' humanity and respond to their needs. The Alvarez home buzzed with activity as Elena moved efficiently between stove and counter, stirring, tasting, adjusting seasonings with the confident touch of someone cooking beloved family recipes. The small kitchen filled with aromas of cumin, chili, and fresh cilantro as she prepared a feast that honored her Guatemalan heritage. Pepián de pollo, a rich chicken stew with roasted vegetables and pumpkin seeds. Fresh corn tortillas patted by hand into perfect circles. Black beans simmered with epazote and garlic. And for dessert, relenitos de plátano, sweet plantain dumplings filled with spiced black beans and dusted with sugar. "Mama, is this enough?" "Chips," Mateo asked, showing her a bowl he'd filled with tortilla chips for the guacamole. Elena glanced over, her hands busy forming another tortilla. "Add a little more, mijo. David and Jamie are our special guests tonight. We want to make sure there's plenty." Miguel entered the kitchen, having just finished setting the dining room table with their best dishes, the hand-painted ceramic plates they brought out only for important occasions. "Anything I can help with?" he asked, stealing a warm tortilla from the stack and earning a playful swat from his wife. "Those are for dinner. And yes, you can help by making sure Sophia finishes her homework before our guests arrive. She's been drawing pictures instead of doing math again." Miguel chuckled, heading toward their daughter's room. "She says drawing helps her think about numbers. Maybe she'll be an architect someday." "Well, today she needs to be a student who completes her multiplication tables," Elena called after him, though her tone held more affection than admonition. The Alvarez family had been planning this dinner all week. What had begun as Miguel's simple suggestion, inviting the Carters over for a home-cooked meal, had evolved into something more significant. A celebration of David's new job at Martinez Auto and a symbolic welcoming of the Carters into their extended family circle. The doorbell rang precisely at 6 o'clock. Miguel opened the door to find David and Jamie standing somewhat awkwardly on the front step. David clutching a small potted plant with yellow flowers, Jamie holding a carefully wrapped package that appeared to be a loaf of bread. "Welcome," Miguel greeted them warmly. Come in. My family's been looking forward to meeting you." David entered with the careful movements of someone trying not to take up too much space in an unfamiliar environment. "Thank you for inviting us. This is just a little something for your home." He held out the plant with a self-consciousness that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being a dinner guest. "It's beautiful," Miguel said sincerely, accepting the gift. "Elena loves plants. And what have you got there, Jamie?" The boy held up his package. "Banana bread. Dad and I made it yesterday. It's my mom's recipe." Something in the simple statement, the mention of Jamie's mother, the fact that father and son had baked together, touched Miguel deeply. He knew what it meant for David to share this connection to his late wife, to teach his son these small but vital continuities of family life. "That's wonderful," Miguel said, gently squeezing Jamie's shoulder. Wait until you taste my wife's dessert. You two can compare recipes. The initial awkwardness began to dissolve as introductions were made. Mateo, exactly Jamie's age and bursting with energy, immediately wanted to show the visitor his collection of soccer cards. Sophia, 2 years younger, but convinced she was actually older in all the ways that mattered, solemnly offered to show Jamie her favorite reading spot by the window. Elena welcomed David with the instinctive hospitality that characterized her. Approach to life, immediately finding ways to make him feel useful by asking his opinion on whether the table needed another candle, whether the music playing softly in the background was at the right volume. Small kindnesses, Miguel noted, watching. His wife expertly eased their guests' discomfort. Not charity, not pity, but the genuine inclusion that says, you belong here. You matter to us. As they gathered around the table, Miguel explained each dish, sharing stories of how his grandmother had taught Elena these recipes, how certain ingredients had been adapted when they moved to America, how their children preferred some dishes spicier than others. Food became not just nourishment but narrative, a way of sharing cultural heritage and family history. This is amazing, David said, after his first bite of the pepián. I've never had Guatemalan food before. The secret is toasting the seeds and spices before grinding them, Elena explained, visibly pleased by his appreciation. It brings out the flavors in a different way. Jamie, initially hesitant with the unfamiliar foods, watched Mateo enthusiastically loading his tortilla with chicken and sauce, then carefully mimicked the technique. His expression after the first bite transformed from caution to delight. It's like tacos, but better, he declared, earning laughs from around the table. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily. David spoke about his first week at Martinez, Auto, the relief of using his skills again, the particular satisfaction of solving mechanical problems. There was this Toyota today, he explained, growing animated as he described a particularly challenging diagnostic issue he'd resolved. Everyone else thought it was the transmission, but I could tell from the sound it was actually Miguel. Noticed how David straightened as he spoke, how his voice gained confidence, how the haunted look that had shadowed his features began to recede. Work provided more than income. It offered purpose, identity, the simple dignity of contributing, value to the world. The children finished eating first and asked to be excused. Soon the sounds of play drifted from Mateo's room, the universal language of 8-year-old boys transcending the differences in their circumstances. Jamie seems to be doing better, Miguel observed, as Elena served coffee and the adults relaxed, into the comfortable conversation that follows a good meal shared. David nodded, a mix of emotions crossing his face. Having regular meals makes a huge difference, and knowing I'll be bringing home a steady paycheck, it's like he can be a kid again instead of worrying about adult problems. Children are resilient, Elena said gently. They bounce back quickly when they feel secure. Sarah used to say that, David replied, a sad smile touching his lips at the mention of his wife. She was a teacher. She understood kids better than anyone I've ever known. Tell us about her, Elena invited, her tone making it clear this was not mere politeness, but genuine interest. Something in her simple request seemed to unlock a door David had kept firmly shut. He began tentatively, sharing small details about Sarah, her love of mystery novels, her habit of singing off-key while grading papers, her patient way with struggling students. Gradually, the memories flowed more freely, stories emerging that painted a portrait of a vibrant, compassionate woman who had been the center of the Carter family's universe. She would have handled all this so much better than I have, David admitted, staring into his coffee cup. The job loss, the money problems. Sarah always had a plan B, C, and D ready for any crisis. It sounds like you're doing exactly what she would want, Elena said firmly, keeping Jamie safe, maintaining his connection to her memory, finding a way forward together. David looked up, momentarily startled by this perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way. Grief makes it hard to see clearly sometimes, Miguel added quietly. When my father died, I spent months feeling like I was failing my family because I couldn't fill his shoes. My mother finally told me she didn't need me to be my father. She needed me to be myself, doing the best I could with what we had. The conversation deepened, moving into territories rarely explored among relative strangers. Loss and resilience, parenting through hardship, the struggle to balance pride with pragmatism when accepting help. Here at the family table, these men from different backgrounds discovered common ground in their shared experiences of fatherhood, of responsibility, of trying to build security for their children in an uncertain world. Elena shared stories of their early years in America, the challenges of navigating a new culture while preserving important traditions. David spoke of meeting Sarah in college, of their dreams for a family, of the devastating speed with which cancer had unraveled their carefully constructed life together. The hardest part, David confessed, has been feeling so alone with it all, like I'm the only one who remembers her, the only one still grieving. You carry her with you in how you raise Jamie, Elena said with the wisdom born of her own family's losses and recoveries. And now you've shared her with us through your stories, through the banana bread you made from her recipe. She isn't gone while you remember her this way. As the evening drew to a close, Miguel noticed a subtle but significant change in David's demeanor, a slight loosening of the tension he carried in his shoulders, a more natural smile, an ease in conversation that hadn't been present when he arrived. The simple act of being welcomed, of sharing food and stories, had provided nourishment beyond the physical. We should do this again, Miguel suggested as their guests prepared to leave. Maybe next time you can teach us how to make Sarah's banana bread, David nodded, genuine warmth in his expression. Jamie would love that, and I'd like that too. As Miguel watched father and son walk to their car, Jamie chattering excitedly about Mateo's soccer cards, David listening with attentive interest. He felt Elena's arm slip around his waist. The conference room at Giovanni's Maple Street location had never hosted such a diverse gathering. Around the large table sat representatives from corporate headquarters, local business owners, community organizers, and the restaurant's own staff. Tension mingled with anticipation as Richard Harmon, CEO of Italian Delights Incorporated, prepared to address the group. 3 weeks ago, Richard began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. A child walked into our restaurant and asked for food that would otherwise be thrown away. What followed has been educational, to say the least. A ripple of soft laughter broke the tension. Everyone present understood the understatement, the viral video, the media frenzy, the public conversation about corporate responsibility and childhood hunger that had ensued. Today, I'm pleased to announce that Italian Delights Incorporated is implementing a comprehensive new approach to food waste and community engagement, not just at Giovanni's, but across all our restaurant brands nationwide. Richard nodded to Melissa Chen, who distributed folders containing professionally designed presentation materials, the corporate marketing machine having transformed what began as crisis management into a fully developed initiative. Our Food for All program has 3 key components, Richard continued. First, a partnership with national food banks to distribute quality surplus food to those in need. Second, a community meal program offering dignified dining options for food-insecure families. And third, employment pathways providing job training and opportunities within our restaurant network. As the CEO detailed each element of the program, Miguel observed the reactions around the table. Rachel Torres nodded approvingly at the practical logistics of food collection and distribution. The school principal seemed particularly interested in the community meal program. Victor, seated at Richard's right hand in a position that signaled his new importance to corporate, maintained a professional expression that barely hinted at the weeks of behind-the-scenes advocacy this announcement represented. Miguel himself, felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride that his simple act of kindness had catalyzed such significant change. Skepticism about corporate motives. Was this genuine commitment or elaborate public relations? Hope that the programs might make real differences in people's lives. And beneath it all, a quiet amazement at how quickly the world could change when the right elements aligned. We recognize that effective community engagement requires local expertise, Richard was saying, which is why we're creating a new position within our corporate structure, Community Outreach Coordinator. He turned to Miguel, who straightened instinctively under the sudden attention. Miguel Alvarez has demonstrated exactly the values and judgment we need in this role. I'm pleased to announce that he has accepted our offer to become Giovanni's first Community Outreach Coordinator, overseeing the implementation of these initiatives here before we expand to other locations. Surprised applause filled the room. Though Miguel had been in discussions about this possibility for days, hearing it announced officially, with his full name, with genuine respect, sent a surge of emotion through him that was difficult to contain. From waiter to corporate position in 3 weeks, from rule breaker to policymaker, from someone who could be fired for feeding a hungry child to someone empowered to create systems ensuring no child would need to ask for leftovers. Again, as the meeting transitioned to collaborative discussion of implementation details, Miguel found himself thinking of his father, a man who had spent his life working physically demanding jobs that barely kept their family afloat, who had impressed upon his children that education and opportunity were the paths to security denied to him. What would he think of his son now, helping shape corporate policy, developing programs that might ease the burdens of families like theirs had been? Miguel's first-hand understanding of food insecurity will be invaluable, Victor was explaining to the group. His connection with the community, his practical experience, his demonstrated compassion. These are precisely the qualities needed to ensure our program actually serves people, rather than just serving our corporate image. The endorsement delivered, with Victor's characteristic precision but unusual warmth, represented perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. The once rigid manager who had enforced policies without question had become an advocate for flexibility, for community responsiveness, for balancing business interests with human needs. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse in smaller discussion groups, Richard approached Miguel privately. "A moment of your time?" They stepped into the hallway, where the CEO's carefully maintained professional demeanor softened slightly. "I wanted you to know that this isn't just corporate damage control," he said, seeming to intuit Miguel's private reservations. "When I started in this business 30 years ago, restaurants were neighborhood institutions. Somewhere along the way, many of us lost that connection to community in pursuit of scale and standardization." Miguel nodded, appreciating the candor, but still cautious. "These programs look promising on paper. The real test will be implementation, whether they're adequately resourced, whether they're sustained when media attention fades." Richard smiled, not offended by the implied challenge. "That's exactly why we need people like you in this role, people who will hold us accountable, who understand that this isn't charity, but responsibility." He extended his hand. "I look forward to seeing what you accomplish here." As the CEO moved away to speak with other attendees, Victor appeared at Miguel's side. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "Going from potential termination to promotion in less than a month?" Miguel shook, his head still processing the whirlwind of changes. "Surreal, exciting, terrifying. I've never done anything like this before, developing programs, managing budgets, coordinating between corporate and community." "Neither had I before becoming manager," Victor pointed out. "But you have something. More important than experience, you have the right instincts. You see people first, policies second. That can't be taught." The unexpected vote of confidence from a man who had once embodied rigid adherence to rules meant more than Miguel could express. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you've done to make this happen. I know you've been advocating behind the scenes." Victor shrugged, uncomfortable, with direct appreciation. "I just helped corporate see the business case for doing the right thing." Speaking of which, he glanced toward the conference room where David Carter was engaged in conversation with Richard Harmon. "Your friend seems to be making quite an impression." David had been invited to the meeting as a community representative. His perspective as Jamie's father considered essential to developing programs that would actually serve families in similar situations. Initially reluctant to participate, he had ultimately agreed when Miguel explained that his input could help shape services that preserved dignity rather than undermining it. Now, watching David speak with animation about effective approaches to food security, Miguel saw a man transformed from the defeated figure he'd first encountered. Regular meals, stable employment, and perhaps most importantly, restored purpose had worked changes both subtle and profound. David stood straighter, spoke with confidence, engaged with others as an equal rather than someone seeking assistance. "He's already volunteered to help with the weekend meal program," Miguel told Victor. "Says he wants to give back now that he's on his feet again." Their conversation was interrupted by Paulo, emerging from the kitchen, carrying a tray of appetizers he'd prepared specially for the meeting. The chef had become an enthusiastic supporter of the new initiatives, particularly the aspect that would allow him to prepare fresh meals for community members rather than see good food discarded. "Try these," he instructed, offering the tray to Miguel and Victor. "Potential items for the community dinner menu. Dignified food, not just scraps. That's what people deserve." As the three men sampled Paulo's creations, Rachel Torres joined them, her practical baker's mind already calculating logistics. "If we coordinate pickup times between businesses, we could maximize efficiency. Giovanni's van could collect from 3 or 4 locations before delivering to the distribution center." The conversation expanded to include others, ideas flowing freely now that corporate resources had been committed to support community-driven solutions. Miguel observed the energy in the room, the genuine engagement of people from different sectors, finding common purpose in addressing a need they all recognized. At the center of it all, though few would have recognized his significance, stood Jamie Carter. The boy had been invited to the meeting's conclusion to hear about the programs his brave request had inspired. He sat now between his father and Mateo Alvarez, who had insisted on accompanying his new friend, the two boys sharing a plate of Paulo's appetizers while half listening to the adult conversations swirling around them. The gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School buzzed with activity as volunteers transformed the utilitarian space into a festive dining hall. Long tables covered in checkered cloths stretched end to end, decorated with simple centerpieces of seasonal flowers. A serving line was being assembled near the kitchen entrance, warming trays ready to receive the food being prepared by a rotating team of local restaurant chefs. At the far end, a small stage had been erected for announcements and acknowledgments. "More to the left," Rachel Torres directed, watching critically as 2 volunteers adjusted a banner above the stage. "Perfect. Now secure that corner before someone gets beamed by falling signage." The banner read, "Community Table, 1-year anniversary. Celebration," with the now familiar logo, a simplified table surrounded by diverse figures prominently displayed. What had begun as an emergency response to one child's hunger had evolved over 12 months into a comprehensive program serving hundreds of families throughout the city. Miguel moved through the gym, clipboard in hand, checking items off his meticulous preparation list. As Giovanni's community outreach coordinator, a position now replicated in 32 other locations across the country, he had become adept at balancing the corporate structure that funded these initiatives with the grassroots approach that made them effective. "Paulo's team is all set up in the kitchen," he reported to Rachel, who had somehow become the unofficial director of these monthly community dinners despite her busy schedule at the bakery. They're preparing enough for at least 300, plus take-home containers for families who need additional meals. Rachel nodded approvingly. The pantry section is ready too. We've got fresh produce from the community garden, bread and pastries from my shop, and the usual non-perishables from the food bank, plus those special dietary options we discussed for families with restrictions. Their easy cooperation reflected a year of collaborative work, ironing out logistical challenges, adjusting approaches based on community feedback, expanding services beyond emergency food assistance to address underlying issues of food security. What had once been a hastily organized response had become a model program, drawing attention from other communities seeking to replicate their success. Across the gym, Victor supervised the technical setup for a short video presentation chronicling the program's first year. His role had evolved as dramatically as Miguel's, from restaurant manager to regional coordinator for community initiatives throughout Italian Delights Incorporated. The promotion had come with a substantial salary increase and the professional recognition he'd long sought, though Victor now measured success by metrics beyond profit margins and operational efficiency. Testing, he spoke into the microphone, adjusting volume levels while giving instructions to the high school students who had volunteered to handle the audiovisual equipment. His manner remained precise and organized, but the rigid formality that had once defined his professional persona had softened, replaced by a more balanced approach that valued both systems and the people they served. "It looks good," David Carter confirmed, checking connections on the projector he'd helped install. "We're all set for the presentation." David's transformation over the past year had been perhaps the most profound. From unemployed and desperate, he had become not only a valued mechanic at Martinez Auto, but an essential volunteer for community programs, particularly those focused on employment assistance. His first-hand experience of job loss and recovery made him uniquely qualified to mentor others navigating similar challenges. The gymnasium doors swung open as Jamie and Mateo burst in, still wearing their soccer uniforms from Saturday morning. Practice followed more sedately by Elena Alvarez carrying a container of homemade horchata for the beverage station. "Dad!" Jamie called, spotting David across the room. "We won, 3-2. And I scored." David's face lit with pride as his son raced toward him, breathless with excitement. "That's fantastic, buddy. Sorry I missed it. Had to help with setup here." "It's okay," Jamie assured him, with the easy confidence of a child secure in his parents' love and attention. "Coach recorded it on his phone. You can watch it later." Miguel watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. Jamie had blossomed. Over the past year, no longer the cautious, hunger-shadowed child who had asked for leftovers, but an energetic 9-year-old whose world had expanded to include soccer, friendships, and the ordinary joys of childhood. The dark circles beneath his eyes had disappeared, replaced by the healthy glow of regular meals and reduced stress. He had grown taller too, his once baggy clothes now fitting properly, partly due to improved nutrition and partly due to David's ability to provide adequately for his son's needs. "Hard to believe it's been a year, isn't it?" Elena commented, joining Miguel as he checked off the beverage station on his list. "Sometimes it feels like that video went viral just yesterday." Miguel nodded, remembering the whirlwind of attention, the corporate panic, the community response that had coalesced around one simple truth: no child should go hungry while food is thrown away. A lot has changed since then. "For the better," Elena added, squeezing his arm affectionately. "I'm proud of you, you know. Not everyone would have taken the risk you did that day." Before Miguel could respond, Christina Zhao arrived with her camera equipment. The food photographer whose video had catalyzed everything had become the unofficial documentarian of the community table program, her images helping to spread the model to other cities and secure continued corporate support. "I wanted to get some shots before the crowd arrives," she explained, already framing the transformed gymnasium through her viewfinder. The before and after makes such a powerful visual story. As volunteers continued to arrive, restaurant workers, teachers, local business owners, families who had received assistance and now gave back through service, Miguel stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection before the event officially began. The spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers from the newly established community garden, where families grew fresh produce to supplement the food assistance programs. Victor joined him, leaning against the brick wall of the school building. "Everything ready inside?" Miguel nodded, just taking a minute to breathe before we opened the doors. They stood in companionable silence. These two men whose professional trajectories had been so dramatically altered by one child's request for leftovers. Their relationship had evolved from the formal manager-employee dynamic into something approaching genuine friendship, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "Corporate sent over the expansion numbers this morning," Victor said eventually. "The program's being implemented in 40 new locations next quarter. They're using our model as the template." That's wow. Miguel absorbed the implications. Tens of thousands of meals, hundreds of families receiving support, employment opportunities, community connections extending far beyond what he could personally oversee. From one meal to all of this in a year. Victor smiled slightly, his expression thoughtful. It makes you wonder how many other solutions are waiting for someone to simply take the first step. How many policies could be changed if people remembered to see the humans they're meant to serve? This philosophical observation from the once strictly by-the-book manager illustrated how profoundly the experience had changed him. Victory's corporate climb continued, but its purpose had shifted, using his position and influence to create systems that helped rather than hindered, that recognized human dignity rather than sacrificing it to efficiency or profit. Inside, they could hear the increasing volume as early arrivals began to fill the gymnasium. Soon the space would be alive with conversation, with families sharing meals regardless of their economic circumstances, with the ordinary miracle of community forming around tables where everyone was welcome. "Time to get back to it," Miguel said, pushing away from the wall. "David's doing the welcome speech today. His first time addressing the whole group." "He'll do fine," Victor said with certainty. "His story is powerful because it's authentic. People respond to that." They re-entered the gymnasium just as families began arriving in earnest, some clearly in need of the food and fellowship offered, others coming to support neighbors or simply enjoy the communal meal. The beauty of the program's design, Miguel thought with pride, was that from the outside it was impossible to distinguish who came from necessity and who from choice. Dignity preserved, community strengthened, needs met without stigma or shame. Jamie and Mateo had been recruited to escort newcomers to available seats, a responsibility they took seriously despite occasional detours into boyish exuberance. Miguel watched as Jamie confidently welcomed a hesitant-looking mother with 3 small children, showing them to a table near the kitchen, where high chairs had been set up for the youngest diners. "Everything ready for the presentation?" Miguel asked David, who was reviewing his notes one final time before taking the stage. David nodded, his nervousness evident but controlled. "I think so. Just a short welcome, introduce the video, thank the key people. I can handle that much public. Speaking, you'll be great," Miguel assured him. "Just speak from the heart like we talked about."